Our next keynote speaker is Rick Atkinson, who is a best-selling author and historian and the winner of Pulitzer Prizes in history and journalism. Formerly a Washington Post reporter, editor, and foreign correspondent, he is the author of the Liberation Trilogy, a narrative account of the American role in Europe and North Africa during World War II. The 3 volumes include An Army at Dawn, The Day of Battle, and The Guns at Last Light. His other books include The Long Gray Line, The American Journey of West Point's Class of 1966, Crusade, The Untold Story of the Persian Gulf War, and In the Company of Soldiers, A Chronicle of Combat. He is currently working on a trilogy about the American Revolution. Rick Atkinson, if you would please come to the podium.
Thank you, Tom. Thanks to the Pioneer Institute, and thanks to all of you for inviting me here this morning. David Kennedy is a professor and a writer and a scholar I've admired for many decades, and he's a tough act to follow. I'd also like to particularly thank any teachers who happen to be in the room this morning. I think for every historian who's had some degree of success, there is somewhere in his or her past a teacher to thank. In my case, it was a guy named Bert B. Cohen. He taught a 2-year course in ancient medieval history in Alexandria, Virginia. I have to say that from Professor Cohen, or from Mr. Cohen, I realized that, as William Faulkner once told us, the past is never dead, it's not even past. This is a season for anniversaries. 70 years ago today, German commanders surrendered their forces in Holland, Northwest Germany, and Denmark. 70 years ago today, in Austria, Salzburg surrendered, and so did Innsbruck. But American troops in Patton's Third Army were fighting diehards in Linz and clearing a corridor into Czechoslovakia for a planned assault on Prague. 70 years ago today, Japanese forces launched an unsuccessful counteroffensive on Okinawa, but 131 suicide planes, kamikazes, sank 17 American ships near the island. 4 days from now, on May 8th, we'll celebrate the 70th anniversary of Germany's surrender, unconditional surrender, and the end of the war in Europe. And 4 months from now, we'll mark the 70th anniversary of Japan's surrender and the end of the most destructive war in human history. This is as good a time as any to reflect on what the war means to us, and Professor Kennedy got us off to a great start. The novelist John Updike once called World War II the 20th century's central myth. He called a vast imagining of a primal time when good and evil contended for the planet, a tale of Troy whose angles are infinite and whose central figures never fail to amaze us with their size, their sweep, their theatricality. The war lasted 2,174 days, and by the end, it had left 60 million dead. That's 27,600 dead every day for 6 years, 1,150 dead an hour. If you were a German boy born between 1915 and 1924, the odds were 1 in 3 that by 1945, you would be dead. 60 million dead in 6 years means a death every 3 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. That's World War II. George C. Marshall, the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, called it a great and terrible epoch. And new words would be required to describe it, words like genocide and superpower, a neologism that was coined in 1944. Old words assumed new usages, words like Holocaust. The war raged across 6 continents on those titanic 3-syllable battlefields that still serve as historical mileposts: Stalingrad, Tarawa, Anzio, Normandy, as well as in improbable settings rarely associated with the Second World War, places like the Aleutians, Madagascar, Syria, Darwin, Australia, and now we can add Oregon. The United States had been among the last of the large powers to be drawn into the flames, but very quickly the war encumbered all of America. When the war began in earnest in 1939 with the German invasion of Poland, the United States Army, still at peace, was a puny weakling. By one measure, it ranked 17th among armies of the world in size and combat power, just behind that perennial military powerhouse, Romania. The U.S. Army in 1939 comprised 190,000 soldiers. It would grow to 8.3 million by 1945. That's a 44-fold increase. A total of 16,112,566 Americans served in uniform during the war in a country of 130 million. Virtually every family had someone they loved in harm's way. Virtually every American had an emotional investment in our military. Virtually everyone had skin in the game. Fighting a world war obviously required manpower, lots of manpower, despite the decision to reduce the number of projected divisions from 215 to 90, as Professor Kennedy just told us. By 1944, 11,000 young men were being drafted into the Army and Navy every day. That's a rate of 4 million a year. 1 in 3 GIs had only a grade school education. Only 1 in 4 held a high school diploma. Only 1 in 10 had a semester or more of college. A private, by the way, earned $50 a month, although if he earned the Medal of Honor and lived to describe the experience, he got an extra $2 a month in his paycheck. The typical soldier was 5 feet 8 inches tall. He weighed 144 pounds. But the war had been very difficult. The Depression had been very difficult on our nation's health. The desperate need for bodies in uniform, especially infantrymen, to go to places like Normandy, led to the drafting of what were known as physically imperfect men. I know many of you women think that phrase is redundant. Standards had been lowered to accept defects that once would have kept young men out of uniform earlier in the war. For example, early in the war, draftees had to have at least 12 of their natural 32 teeth. By 1944, how many teeth did you have to be drafted into the United States Army? 0. And that's because the Army and the Navy drafted 1/3 of all the dentists in the United States. And collectively, they extracted 15 million teeth, they filled 68 million more, and they made 2.5 million sets of dentures, all to enable each recruit to be able to masticate the Army ration. I know that sounds like an obscene act, but that was the standard. By 1944, a man could be drafted with 2,400 vision if it was correctable to 20/40 in one eye. Soldiers joked that the Army didn't examine eyes, it just counted them. And in fact, you could be drafted if you were blind in one eye. You could be drafted if you were deaf in one ear, if you were missing both external ears. You could be drafted if you were missing a thumb or a great toe or 3 fingers on one hand, including your trigger finger. Venereal disease had kept many men out of uniform early in the war. But that restriction also was lifted, and the Army soon was drafting 12,000 men a month with VD, most of them syphilitic. How could they do that? Penicillin, the extraordinary discovery of the antibiotic agent by British scientists in the 1920s, was followed by a massive effort by the Americans and the British to take a substance that had been made by the gram and to make it by the kilogram and eventually by the ton. Mental and personality standards for service in the armed forces also had been loosened. In April 1944, the War Department decreed that draftees need only have a reasonable chance of adjusting to military life, although psychiatric examiners at draft boards were advised to watch for 24 personality deviations, including silly laughter, sulkiness, resentfulness of discipline, and other traits that would seemingly disqualify every teenager in the United States. Well, why these extreme measures to fill the ranks? Because of the crying need for soldiers, especially infantrymen and especially riflemen. Even in a country of 130 million, we were running out. The British did run out. The war remained brutal and voracious to the very end. In April 1945, the last full month of the war in Europe, nearly 11,000 American soldiers were killed in action in Germany. That's almost as many as had been killed in June 1944, the month of the Normandy invasion. It was awful, virtually to the last gunshot. World War is a clash of systems. Which system can generate the combat power to prevail, whether it's in the form of 12,000 airplanes aloft on D-Day at Normandy, the 10-to-1 advantage in artillery ammunition often enjoyed by the Allies, the mass production of penicillin and proximity fuses, the ability to design, build, deliver, and detonate an atomic bomb. Which system can produce and educate the men? And they were mostly men, which is why the war took so long. Which system can produce the men capable of organizing the shipping, the rail and truck transportation, the stupendous logistical demands of global war? The war cost U.S. taxpayers $296 billion. That's $4 trillion in today's currency. To help underwrite a military budget that increased 8,000%, President Roosevelt had expanded the number of taxpayers in this country from 4 million to 42 million. For the European theater alone, American industry produced 18 million tons of war materiel. Churchill called it a prodigy of organization. And that kit ranged from 800,000 military vehicles to footwear in sizes 2A to 22 EEE. U.S. munitions plants during the war turned out 40 billion rounds of small arms ammunition, plus 56 million grenades. By 1945, the United States had built 2/3 of all ships afloat worldwide. And the United States was making half of all manufactured goods worldwide. Well, how almost 70 years after the shooting stopped do we assess the consequences? The legacy of World War II is as profound as the sacrifices that built that legacy. First, of course, Allied victory strangled the sinister ambitions of Germany, Japan, and Italy. It also brought to an end the British and French empires. It politically fractured both a continent, Europe, and individual countries, such as Korea, Vietnam, and Germany. It led to the creation of the United States and NATO, and it yielded a bipolar world, part Soviet, part American, that persisted for half a century. A war that was fundamentally about liberty spawned independence movements and colonial wars that led to the creation of modern India, Pakistan, Ghana, Kenya, Israel, and other states in a fermentation that obviously continues to this day. We Americans emerged from World War II with extraordinary advantages that ensured prosperity for decades, an intact, thriving industrial base, a population relatively unscarred by war, cheap energy, 2/3 of the world's gold supply, great optimism. As the major power in Western Europe, Mediterranean, and the Pacific, possessing both atomic weapons and an army, a navy, air force of unequaled might, the United States was ready to exploit what the historian H.P. Wilmot described as the end of the period of European supremacy in the world that had existed for 4 centuries. The war largely dispelled American isolationism, even as it encouraged American exceptionalism, as well as a penchant for military solutions and a self-regard that caused some to label our epic the American century. Remember what John Adams told us? Power always thinks it has a great soul. The war was a potent catalyst for social change across the Republic. New technologies, jets, computers, ballistic missiles, mass production of houses, soon spurred vibrant new industries, which in turn encouraged the migration of black workers from south to north, and of all peoples to the emerging West. The GI Bill put millions of soldiers into college classrooms, spurring unprecedented social mobility. World War II was perhaps the greatest agent of social change in this country during the 20th century. Our national evolution on core issues of racial and gender equality are very much shaped by the war. The US military was segregated during World War II, true enough, and exclusionary. A long study by the US Army War College on the role of black Americans in combat during World War I, a study that was written in the 1920s and sent to the Army Chief of Staff, concluded that, quote, the Negro is by nature subservient and believes himself to be the inferior of the white man. He cannot control himself in the face of danger to the extent the white man can. He has not the initiative and resourcefulness of the white man. The Negro is a rank coward in the dark. As a fighter, he's been inferior to the white man even when led by white officers. The Negro officer was a failure as a combat officer in World War I. Close quote. World War II began in 1939, and when it began, there were fewer than 4,000 blacks serving in the Army. By early 1944, that number had increased to 750,000. And the disparity between the avowed principles for which the nation fought and the stark hypocritical reality of American life in the 1940s gave impetus and legitimacy to the civil rights movement. Many African Americans endorsed what they called the Double V campaign, a righteous struggle for victory over both enemies abroad and racism at home. Severe restrictions on combat roles for black troops gradually eased. A group of fighter pilots known as the Tuskegee Airmen demonstrated the inanity of those restrictions, including assertions that black pilots lacked the reflexes to be good fighter pilots. The hundreds of thousands of blacks who served in the Army during the war, including thousands who volunteered as combat infantrymen after the Battle of the Bulge in the winter of 1944, helped demonstrate the moral bankruptcy and intellectual depravity of attitudes like those evinced in that Army War College study. Today, the Army is about 20% black. There are more than 80 African American general officers in our military today. It's also true that the Army in World War II was an overwhelmingly male institution and exclusively male in senior leadership roles. There were about 1,300 generals in the US Army in 1944, and not one of them was a woman. The first female Army officer was not promoted to general until 1970. But the extraordinary demand for military manpower meant that women were drawn into the national workplace in exceptional numbers, some 19 million working outside the home. It's very hard to put that genie back in the bottle. Incidentally, in today's military, about 16% of officers and 7% of general officers are women. World War II was among the greatest stories of the 20th century, and it ought to be taught and learned as a story with character, plot, conflict. When we contemplate what is lost to us culturally as that World War II generation slowly slips into the shadows, and there are about 1 million left alive of the 16 million who served in uniform, we contemplate what's lost It's perhaps their ability to bear witness, to tell the story firsthand, to attest with authenticity and authority why they fought, suffered, and died. 15 million American veterans have left us. Of those 16 million, once in uniform, and for all the stories told and retold, countless others will now go untold. No one bears witness to the most elemental emotions of war, including fear and despair, like those who were there. A soldier in the 36th Infantry Division, which had been the Texas National Guard, once confessed, "I was scared for 23 months. I saw the best troops in the world cut down and replaced 3 or 4 times." No one can convey the vivid immediacy of combat better than the eyewitness, like the crewman describing an anti-aircraft fire barrage over Romania. It came like a mighty shout, a malediction hurling up at us through 4 miles of twisting wind. They were everywhere. The dark flowers of flak were everywhere. So as the primary storytellers die off, it's important for their survivors, for us, to sustain the story, to keep it a vivid narrative that lives and breathes rather than something desiccated, rapidly receding into the past with ever diminishing power to stir us. What did it cost beside $296 billion? Well, 13 U.S. divisions in Europe suffered at least 100% casualties. 5 more suffered at least 200% casualties. From all theaters, American service casualties in the war included 1,700 left blind, 11,000 with at least partial paralysis of 1 or more limbs, and 18,000 amputations among U.S. soldiers. Aggregate numbers illuminate how unspeakably inhuman the war was. Teasing out the deaths one at a time affirms our humanity. As we look at these big arrows on the map and contemplate the greatest self-inflicted catastrophe in human history, 60 million dead, it's proper to bear in mind the miraculous singularity of death. Each of those deaths was as unique as a fingerprint or a snowflake. Patricia O'Malley was a year old when her father, Major Richard James O'Malley, a battalion commander in the 12th Infantry Regiment, was killed by a sniper in Normandy. After seeing his headstone for the first time in the cemetery above Omaha Beach, Patricia O'Malley wrote, "I cried for the joy of being there and the sadness of my father's death. I cried for all the times I needed a father and never had one. I cried for all the words I wanted to say and wanted to hear, but had not. I cried and cried." The Australian war correspondent Osmer White, who bore witness both in the Pacific and with Patton's Third Army in Europe, later wrote, "The living have the cause of the dead in trust. We, the living, 320 million strong in America today, have the cause of the dead in trust." About 400,000 Americans died during the war, as Professor Kennedy said, including 291,000 killed in action. In 1947, the next of kin of all American troops who had been buried overseas, and that was nearly all who had died in Europe and the Pacific, the Mediterranean, and whose bodies had been recovered, those next of kin filled out Quartermaster Form 345. It was a one-time option offered by the U.S. government whether to have their sons, and they were mostly sons, brought home for permanent reburial or buried overseas in one of a dozen American Battle Monuments Commission cemeteries. Almost 40% chose to leave their boys overseas. 60% brought them home. Regardless of where they were ultimately buried, it cost $564.50 to reopen each grave, something only a rich, victorious country could afford. And every grave was opened by hand, and the remains of every dead soldier dusted with an embalming compound of formaldehyde, aluminum chloride, wood powder, clay, and plaster of Paris. They were then placed in a metal casket with a satin pillow. Labor strikes in the United States had caused a shortage of casket steel, and repatriation was further delayed by a dearth of licensed embalmers. In warehouses at Cherbourg, Cardiff, and elsewhere, the dead accumulated. Finally, the SS Joseph V. Connolly, the first of 21 ghost ships from Europe and the Pacific, sailed from Antwerp with more than 5,000 soldiers in her hold. On October 27, 1947, the Connolly berthed in New York. Stevedores winched the caskets from the hold 2 by 2 in specially designed slings, and a great diaspora began as these dead and those that followed traveled mostly by rail across the Republic for burial in their hometown cemeteries and in national cemeteries. Among those waiting was Henry A. Wright, a widower who lived on a farm in southwestern Missouri. One by one, his dead sons arrived at the local train station. Sergeant Frank H. Wright, killed on Christmas Eve, 1944, in the Battle of the Bulge. Then Private Harold B. Wright, who had died of his wounds in a German prison camp on February 3, 1945. And finally, Private Elton E. Wright, killed in Germany on April 25th, just 2 weeks before the end of the war in Europe. Gray and stooped, the elder Wright watched as the caskets were carried in to the rustic bedroom where each of those boys had been born. Neighbors kept vigil overnight, carpeting the floor with roses, and in the morning they bore the brothers to Hilltop Cemetery for burial side by side by side. That's how the dead came home. But what of their belongings? What of the things they carried? Long before the dead came home, those things had been coming back. At a large warehouse on 601 Hardesty Avenue in Kansas City, the U.S. Army Effects Bureau had begun as a modest quartermaster enterprise with a half dozen employees in February 1942. That expanded to more than 1,000 workers, and by August 1945, they were handling 60,000 shipments a month, each laden with the effects of American dead from 6 continents. Hour after hour, day after day, shipping containers were unloaded from rail freight cars onto a receiving dock and then hoisted by elevator to the depot's 10th floor. And here the containers traveled by assembly line conveyor belt from station to station down to the 7th floor as inspectors pawed through the crates to extract ammunition, pornography, perhaps amorous letters from a girlfriend you didn't want a grieving widow to see. Workers used grinding stones and dentist drills to remove corrosion and blood from helmets, and laundresses took pains to scrub bloodstains out of field jackets and uniform blouses. A detailed inventory was then pinned to each repacked container before it was stacked in a storage bin. And all the while, banks of typists in a huge adjacent room were hammering out correspondence to the next of kin, up to 70,000 letters a month. And the gist of those letters was this: Dear Sir, Dear Madam, we have your dead son's stuff. Do you want it back? Where should we send it? Well, over the years, Effects Bureau inspectors found amazing things in those effects: tapestries, enemy swords, a German machine gun, an Italian accordion, walrus tusks, a shrunken head, a tobacco sack full of diamonds. Among thousands of diaries also collected in Kansas City was a small notebook that had belonged to Lieutenant Herschel G. Horton, 29, from Aurora, Illinois. shot in the right leg and hip during a firefight with the Japanese in New Guinea, Horton had dragged himself into a grass shanty, and over the several days that it took for him to die, he'd scribbled a final letter home to his family in that notebook. It began, "My dear, sweet father, mother, and sister, I lay here in this terrible place, wondering not why God has forsaken me, but why he is making me suffer." The first duty for all of us is to remember. Our recent poet laureate, Natasha Trethewey, ends her poem, Pilgrimage, which is about a visit to Vicksburg, with these lines: "In my dream, the ghost of history lies down beside me, rolls over, pins me beneath a heavy arm." It's vital that we too feel that heavy arm. Thanks so much for having me here with you this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick, for that strong contextualization and personalization of the effects of World War II. Thank you very much. Rick and David have agreed to take a few minutes of questions, and so we'll entertain those questions. If you wouldn't mind coming up to the table here. Okay, behind you.
First of all, I'd like to thank both presenters for upholding the standards of their profession as historians by not using PowerPoint. Thank you very much. My question is for Professor Kennedy, which is, you mentioned the beneficiaries, prime beneficiary of the war being the United States. But there was a downside to that, which I think needs to be put in perspective. And I can think of at least two issues. One being what President Eisenhower referred to as the permanent military-industrial complex. And the other one is somewhat lesser known, but I think more important to pioneer. And that's what started out in January of 1945 as an educational improvement, reform, called life adjustment education. And this was it was the beginning of dumbing down, basically, and it affects us even today. And I was wondering if you could put in better perspective some of those downsides from World War II that we are still suffering through today.
Well, let me start by saying I'm unfamiliar with your second item. Maybe Rick knows more about it, so I'm going to have to take a pass on that one, unless you want to elucidate a little bit and give us a stronger cue. What life adjustment education, did I hear it right?
Let me give it to you very quickly. Life adjustment was based on the idea that only 20% of the school kids, high school kids, were going to college, another 20% going to trade school, and the other 60% having to go through life adjustment, which means being adjusted to not having the ambitions in life that you might want to have. And one of the primary damages that was done to this was done to women, because they were hauled out of the defense buildings and factories and sent into the kitchen with their aprons on, you see. And that spun off the 1950s period of the suburban woman, if you will. So there's a whole bunch of side effects to this. And the Dick and Jane books, which I'm sure you read in school yourself, this was all a product of that very bad educational reform.
Well, I still, thank you for that. I still have no more acquaintance with it than what you just said. But let's go to the other side of that educational ledger, and something that Rick Atkinson mentioned is the GI Bill. And about 8 million men took advantage of that, and not all of them went to college. A lot of them went to vocational institutions and learned a trade, not just didn't just get a college degree. There's a very famous study of the sources of economic growth in the United States between 1945 and 1970 by a guy named Edward Denison, which became a landmark study for all the students of economic growth. And the single greatest factor in the fabulous performance of the American economy in the generation after World War II that Dennison identifies is the upgrading of the collective skill level of the American workforce, and in turn he attributes a big piece of that to the GI Bill. So this is a direct wartime legacy that very, very, very immediately and directly informed the performance of this economy after the war. And let me just return to something Rick said, put a little deeper point on it maybe. I'm reminded here of a famous line in the Philip Roth novel, American Pastoral. Some of you may have read it. It's, I think, one of Philip Roth's great novels. But there's a passage in the early pages of that book where he's trying to make the reader understand the mood of post-war America, and he describes it as the greatest moment of collective inebriation in all of American history. And that's not far off the mark. I mean, that post-war era was a time of giddy national self-confidence, self-congratulation, having fought the good war, having fought it, we thought, at least at that time, in an upright way. And this society reaped the benefits of that for a long generation after the war, not just in materially measurable ways like the GI Bill, but also, in my view, it's no accident that the civil rights movement achieves the successes that it did in the post-war period in the midst of that generation's worth of collective inebriation, national self-confidence, shared prosperity, all of which are direct outflows from the war. We finally take care of a big piece of that agenda, which had been delayed for a century since emancipation and the Civil War.
This is for both panelists. I've never seen a good answer to this question. Did the Allied bombing campaign in Europe yield more than it cost?
Did it yield more than it cost, did you say? Yeah, of course it yielded more than it cost. I mean, you can put a dollar figure on it, and you can put a price in lives on it. The hazard of being a crewman in a B-17 or a B-24 was extraordinarily high. There were no jobs available in the military that were more dangerous than being a crewman flying in those heavy bomber missions. But the consequence was to hammer the Third Reich and its dependencies in a way that you could certainly see by 1945 made it very difficult for them to wage the kind of expansionary war that they had hoped to be waging. You know, my feeling is that if you understand what the aspirations were in having an air campaign that leaped over the fielded force that the Germans had, say, in Normandy, and began to attrit and erode and eviscerate the German war machine, and you see what the consequences were of the attriting and evisceration of that war machine by 1945, you can't really have any doubt that the campaign was effective. Now, we smashed 60 German cities to smithereens, almost 7 million dead Germans, and of the civilians who were killed, a number of those, hundreds of thousands, were killed in the bombing campaign. That's certainly a cost to the Germans that's profound, but in my estimation is it was worth it.
Well, I think I agree with that answer. Let me just add that the question you asked was very much on the minds of people at the time, and the advocates of air power, especially strategic air power, caused something to be formed called the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, which was quite a scientific and systematic attempt to answer your question. And after months, if not years, of study by psychologists, economists, industrial engineers, so on and so forth, in post-war Germany, and for that matter, post-war Japan, trying to answer the question, what exactly was the effect of the strategic bombing campaign? What was its contribution to victory? They couldn't come up with a conclusive answer. It remained a very, very elusive thing. But one of the pieces of data that came out of all that intensive examination is perhaps a little bit relevant to us today. I'm doing this from memory, so I might not get the numbers precisely right, but I'll come close enough, that it turned out, on average, in the air campaign in Europe, to be certain of the destruction of one target took something on the order, if I'm remembering this correctly, of 147 airplanes dropping 648 tons of bombs, because the bombing techniques were so inaccurate, and we couldn't deliver the ordnance with any kind of precision. So it was a kind of a crude method of warfare, actually, which is part of the reason why civilian casualties were as high as they were, despite things like the Norden bomb sight and so on. We just couldn't deliver the ordnance with the precision that later smart bomb technology allows us to do.
Yes.
Thank you. I wonder what your question you can answer is, what do you think about the United States bringing known Nazis, either like Wernher von Braun, intelligence officers, who in many cases should have been shot, bring them into this country and allow them an umbrella of safety and to run some of our most important programs? Maybe some were anti-communist, maybe some had technological, but again, they were known Nazis.
Well, Wernher von Braun, for example, he's brought here in part because we recognize that the Germans have been working on a missile program that would be very useful to us after the war. Von Braun wrote a memoir later called I Aim for the Stars, and the comedian Mort Saul said the subtitle should be, "But Sometimes I Hit London." So Wernher von Braun is a good Nazi. He's an SS officer. He's a war criminal. But the expediencies of post-war thinking in bringing not only von Braun, but many others of his ilk who had expertise in not only rocketry, but things like metallurgy, nuclear research, atomic weapon research, and so on, led to a kind of early weapons race. The Russians were gathering up whatever they could find in their portions of occupied Germany. The United States very aggressively was pulling out all of the manpower, brain power that we could find to bring back to the United States in order to not only debrief them about how far they had gone in their respective programs during the war, but also potentially to contribute to us, to contribute to our efforts post-war. What do I think about it? I think von Braun and others should have been prosecuted personally, but I recognize that in the spirit of the times, there was no appetite for that, and in general, I'm happy that we got them and the Russians didn't. I think that if, in fact, you acknowledge the realities of both sides meaning at that point the Soviets and the Americans competing in one way or another for the kind of competition that we're going to see through the 1950s and beyond, then that program, and it was a very elaborate, very specifically designed, very well thought out program of scooping up people and material and bringing it back, makes perfect sense.
Yeah, and let's not forget that, though you're absolutely right, that the Wernher von Braun episode has its roots in World War II, it also stitches right into a subsequent chapter in history called the Cold War. And in fact, I would say the Cold War is the proper context in which to understand Eisenhower's warning about the military-industrial complex. Clearly, World War II demonstrates the war-winning advantage that a fully mobilized industrial economy has in that phase of the history of warfare. But let's not forget, this country demobilized in a hurry after World War II, and when it was proposed in a famous document called NSC 68 in 1949 that we go back onto a partially fully mobilized military footing in the context of the Cold War, that was thought to be politically impossible until the Korean War broke out, and it's in that context that Eisenhower delivers his warning. So history goes on. Not every single thing that happened since 1945 can be directly attributable to the war itself. And the Cold War is the context in which Wernher von Braun is given the pass.
I think we have time for one more.
Stalin and Roosevelt and Churchill were an uneasy alliance militarily and during the war. Among the three, who was the best negotiator and who achieved most of his diplomatic objectives by the end of the war?
Well, they're all three pretty titanic personalities. But again, you know, the settled record, seems to me, has to pretty strongly underwrite the conclusion that it was Roosevelt who achieved more of his objectives more securely than any of the other of the big three. I mean, Churchill won the war, to be sure, ended up on the winning side, but the British Empire has never been the same since. And it was the extractions or the stresses of the war that kind of was the coup de grace for the British Empire in many ways. Stalin achieved a lot of things, especially in Eastern and Central Europe, and consolidated his hold on the Soviet Union, to be sure, but fell short of the grandest ambitions of the Leninist-Stalinist tradition. Whereas Roosevelt kept his country secure, secured Western Europe at least, began the process, and I do think this is attributable to the whole chain of events that the war puts in motion, to the decolonization of Asia and of Africa eventually within less than a generation after the war. All of these long-standing U.S. foreign policy objectives even well before Franklin Roosevelt. So he'd be my nominee.
I think it depends in part on whether you're looking at the ambitions of each of those three that you named through the whole war, or whether you're looking at, say, Yalta and Potsdam at the end of the war. Of course, Roosevelt's gone by the time of Potsdam, but if you anticipate that Roosevelt in 1941, December 1941, is looking to minimize American costs in blood particularly, and hoping that he can get the Russians to do most of the dying for us, then he's hugely successful. And he's also hoping he can get the Russians to do most of the killing for us. And in that, he is titanically successful. There were more Russian soldiers who die at Stalingrad than American soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines die in the whole war in all theaters. The Russians killed more Germans by a factor of 9 than American and British soldiers together killed. So if you're Roosevelt and you're hoping that that's the outcome of this alliance with the devil, and Stalin certainly is a devil, then that is an enormously successful.
And American machines and Russian men. A very cynical way to put it all, but a pretty accurate, rough and ready description of what the situation was.
Well, thank you, David and Rick, for those very high caliber, thoughtful presentations. Thank you very much. Great job.